everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of Jim 1537's Metaphysical Tools for Transformation. Again, I'm joined by my wife, Meremystic.
Hello, everybody. We've got an interesting show planned for you today. Today, we're going to talk about the concept of defense mechanisms, rationalizations, and the idea of it's complicated. And Jim, I thought it would be a good idea if, before we start, we talk a little bit about the concept of what defense mechanisms are and what role they play in our life. If you could talk to us about that.
I would love to. Well, simply stated, our defense mechanisms are designed to keep us alive, to allow us to survive, to protect us. And certainly, the easiest way to think of that is back in the jungles, our defense mechanisms kept us alive from attack, from wild animals, that sort of thing. Now, of course, defense mechanisms could apply to any aspect of our life, but simply stated, they're designed to protect us and keep us alive.
So we all have these defense mechanisms. It's something that is there within all of us. It's
Absolutely.
part of who we are as a human being.
Yes.
Yes, okay, it's there. Is it the same thing as being defensive?
Well, I think one could say that it is in a sense because the defense mechanisms then could trigger us being defensive, say guarded, unapproachable, not willing to listen to input. You know, we're taking it out of looking at it just from physical survival, but into our psychological and emotional dynamics too.
Well, when we get defensive, frequently we start rationalizing things and making excuses for ourselves to kind of validate our defense mechanisms. So how do our rationalizations, since we want to talk about that today, tie in with our defense mechanisms?
Well, I think it's a really good point, and I think really crucial to our ability to be able to transform and heal this aspect of our lives. Okay, if we come from the premise that our defense mechanisms are visceral, they are within us on a strong level. Okay, so they're always there ready to be summoned. They're always present to a point. That what happens is that our emotions, our rationalizations, our desires, our sense of self-identity, what we want, could end up then connecting with our defense mechanisms. In other words, where they sort of fuse together. And then what happens is that through our rationalizations, we start in our own mind, architecting the idea that a situation, whether it's a relationship or anything that we want, is our survival. In other words, it doesn't matter whether it's good for us or bad for us, but our rationalizations sit there and hijack, you could say, the defense mechanisms, and then what happens is that we have equated our rationalizations, our excuses, our denial, our ego, our emotions, with the exact same thing of, I have to have this to survive. My life and death survival depend on this.
Is it possible, too, that because we feel these emotions so intensely, we don't question whether they're right or wrong?
I think that's exactly right. In other words, when we feel something, we've all made this mistake, I believe, that we assume it's real. In other words, since I feel it, it has to be real. That's not necessarily true. I mean, we could even look at the example of the rapture of last year. That, of course, most people thought the rapture was comedic. And then here these people actually believed they were going to heaven. They built their whole life around it. They squandered their life savings. They had people ready to take care of their pets, to take care of their last wishes. And then, of course, it didn't happen. But for those people, and I'm not making fun of them, but for those people, their sense of survival was based on the rapture. So that rationalization, that sense of excuse, that sense of emotional intensity hijacked the defense mechanism. So when we feel it emotionally, it's very seldom that we sit there and question those emotions because we're overwhelmed by the intensity. And because of that intensity, we just assume that it's real when it may not be.
Well, one of the things I think is interesting is that we don't always question whether or not those defense mechanisms are appropriate. I remember reading in a psychology book where they talked about defense mechanisms. Your mind does them again in a situation. It will use a defense mechanism it has used before simply because it worked before. Doesn't matter whether it's appropriate to the situation at hand.
I think that's exactly right. And it makes sense because it's so visceral and it's so volatile and all consuming that when we have something that quote unquote worked before, like say somebody yelled at us and we attacked them, and then we felt superior, we felt that we won. So we're going to repeat that again because it's so almost instinctive that we will repeat those defense mechanisms over and over again, regardless of whether they're appropriate or helpful or not. In other words, what we may have done when we were 13 that was a defense mechanism is certainly maybe not appropriate when we're 45.
Sure, sure. Or your boss doesn't respond the same way your parents do.
or say a kid in school.
You're
or
right.
say a kid in school.
Right,
Sure.
yeah, yeah, exactly. How do we take this? I mean, obviously, one of the things that we're trying to do is to take this energy and learn to transform it. Obviously, defense mechanisms are intended to protect us, so the intent is good. But we need to try to find a way to take it and make it work in our life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think there's several tools that I would recommend here. I think one of the things that we have to do is, as trying to be conscious and spiritual people, is to sit there and say, okay, we cannot just lead with our emotions. We cannot just live based on our emotions, because sometimes our emotions are not healthy, positive, in our best interest, or certainly not spiritual. So the first thing we do is we step back from the intensity. So let's say we might feel this overwhelming feeling that this is our survival and we are just 100% in, like almost the idea that metaphorically we're in a boxing match and we're fighting for our life and we're ready to knock that other person out. When we feel that way, we need to step back from the situation and examine it as dispassionately as we can. Now, the exception to that, obviously, is if our lives are literally threatened, which is very, very seldom, thank God. There's very few situations where we have a gun pointed at our head, even though we may feel that somebody challenging our beliefs or challenging our opinion is the same thing as having a gun pointed at our head. We may feel the exact same intensity, but it's not the same intensity in reality. And so I think what we have to do is first step back and look at it dispassionately. And then from there, to start bringing in the various tools that we can do to transform and heal our lives.
Well, it seems like that sometimes we take these energies and it's we've talked about the fight or flight response and feeling literally physically threatened. But if say that I'm in the middle of getting a reading and the person who's reading for me says this relationship, this friendship, this job is not going to work out, why do I respond the same way to that as I were someone actually physically threatening me?
Well, it's because the defense mechanisms have been allocated or hijacked by the emotions, the rationalizations, the ego, and the desire bodies. In other words, that's what ends up happening. So in other words, in that person's mind, and by the way, this example you brought up is very, very typical in a reading. I experience it quite frequently.
I have too. Sure.
Right, sure. So if we're talking about, let's say, the most typical example, I'm telling somebody that the person that they believe is the love of their life, that they cannot survive without their love, that their love is their oxygen. And I'm saying, look, this really is not going to work in my opinion, and they will have a really volatile reaction where they will try and demonize me and vilify me and find any way they can to make me wrong, even to a point where certain clients have then tried to trick the reading by asking a misleading or a false question or say something that was false to throw me off. And as a side point, it's very easy to throw off any reader in a reading, because if you lie to them or engage in falsehoods, that energy becomes a part of the collective energy in the reading and it pollutes it. Just like if you take a pure glass of water and put a little bit of dirt in it, it ruins everything. But back to the point of why does this person feel that way? Because they have falsely allocated their survival and allowed themselves to hijack their defense mechanisms into believing that. And that happens frequently, and it's very unfortunate when that does happen, because it's to the disadvantage of the person who believes something that is ultimately not going to work.
And I think so much of it becomes a rationalization. And I think if we could, I'd like to spend a couple minutes talking about that,
Yeah.
about some of the rationalizations that we use to kind of pat our defense mechanisms on the back and give them an attaboy. One of them is I think our own intellect, because I think we say to ourselves, look, I'm an intelligent person. I'm smart. I deal with this. I deal with that. And they don't understand the difference between getting something mentally and getting it emotionally.
Oh, I think all of your points are well taken. Okay, say for example, there's a difference between intellectual intelligence and emotional intelligence.
Right.
In other words, people with 3 PhDs struggle with the same emotional denial and self-delusion as somebody who dropped out of high school.
Right.
So what happens is that then a person uses their intellect to sort of, I guess you could say, excuse the emotions or fluff over the emotions or make the emotions okay.
Or even browbeat others.
Oh, absolutely. In other words, you don't know them like I do. I know this person, you don't. Okay, that's that right there. Well, of course, the reader doesn't know the person. The therapist doesn't know the person. But they have a dispassionate level of insight to offer that could be helpful. And it's the idea of considering that might be helpful. So that's one of the things, the intellect, the idea of creating false realities around the relationship. In other words, I saw the look in their eye. I'm seeing them in my dreams when they may or may not be. They're communicating with me when they may not even really be thinking of them. I know how they feel about me even though they're not calling me. In other words, at a certain point, we could believe anything we want. I mean, people could believe the world is eight-sided. People could believe anything. And those beliefs are so powerful that we assume the power of the emotion makes it real. But this is where the intellect and the emotion have to be looked at in different ways. Emotions always have to be looked at from a skeptical point of view. I may feel this, but I may be wrong. I may feel this, but it may not ultimately be right. Because that's what's important, is to not let the emotions, in a sense, hijack the intellect and our intuition. Intuition and emotion blur together very, very easily.
Yes, they do.
So we might have intuition, but then when it's our subjective situation, our emotions pollute the intuition
Right.
and masquerade as being truthful. In other words, and then people will say, and here's where they try and browbeat, oh, well, Spirit said to me. Okay, that statement already presumes that it was Spirit who said it, and that it was accurate, and that it was heard accurately. It's not a guarantee that Spirit really said this, or that it was heard correctly. So in dealing in realities like intuition, our emotional projections, the things we want, we must maintain a sense of being skeptical, not cynical, but skeptical.
The other one that I think is a rationalization that unfortunately is used too often, whether it's on the client end or sometimes on the psychic end, is the concept of it's karmic. And therefore it's meant to happen.
Right, exactly. And I deal with that a lot as a reader. I'm sure you have too.
Sure.
Where it's the concept that if something is karmic frequently when it is important in our lives. If it's compelling to us, if we're compelled to run toward it or run away from it, it is presumed to be karmic. Deep relationships, parents, children, lovers, family, relationships that are hugely life-altering, for better or worse, are usually karmic. That in and of itself doesn't really mean as much as people think it does. Because it's karmic does not guarantee the outcome that we subjectively want.
Right.
In other words, to bring up a horrific example, I knew somebody who once had cancer and battled with it for 10 years. They could have said, well, of course this is karmic, but I'm going to survive this, as if that the story has the conclusion that we want. But they didn't survive it. That wasn't the lesson. So just because it's karmic doesn't mean that we get what we want. It means that there's a lesson there, but sometimes the lesson goes the way we want. Sometimes it does not.
Well, I think I like to say to people that it's not as karmic as you think, because sometimes karmic means there's an opportunity. There's agreed upon opportunity, not necessarily an agreed upon outcome.
Yeah, very, very good point. Right. It may seem like a subtlety to many people, but it's not really a subtlety in my opinion. I think it's very fundamental, because karma is going to bring the situation to bear. But there may be a sense of, okay, the two of you are coming together. there's opportunity. What you do with it is a little bit more open-ended than you may think. It's not just predestined. It's not just you're living out a script where a higher power has determined the conclusion ahead of time. And I think that's true, that people assume that because it's karmic, that it's predestined, and ultimately that they're going to get what they want. And obviously that's not always true, but certainly karmic situations, even the most compelling of those situations, are sometimes opportunity-oriented versus conclusion-driven.
What about using karma as a scapegoat?
Oh, I think spiritual people do it all the time. In other words, it's karmic, therefore it's intense, therefore it's real, therefore it means something, therefore whatever I'm going through is justified, therefore I get what I want in the end. It's sort of like creating this kind of snowball effect or domino effect, that karma then becomes the domino effect of all of those different sets of thought forms, emotions, ego, rationalizations, and sometimes false conclusions.
And it's not destiny. To keep that in mind is a spiritual maxim. Karma is not destiny. It's not the same thing.
Right, and sometimes there are karmic situations that have destiny elements to them, of course, but it doesn't mean that karma equals destiny every single time. Oh, of course not. Of course it doesn't mean that. And there's so many different levels of karma. There are the extremely binding levels of karma. And then there's some that are not so binding. Then there's some that we could make worse through the way that we handle. There's some that we can resolve and make better. So it's not as much of a one-size-fits-all concept as people think. It is more multi-layered and multifaceted.
The other rationalization that probably is one of my favorites that I hear people talk about is the concept of it's complicated, because it's like, people use this, you're trying to explain what you feel in a situation, and they're like, no, you don't understand. This is complicated. And I find it interesting because we talked a couple of episodes back about the transformational moment and that aha moment, and how that's always generally very clear and very basic. So how do we move that from basic, clear, aha, to it's complicated?
Well, I think what happens is that, in this sense, it's also cultural. If you hear what's going on from a societal point of view, it's complicated is kind of a new pop culture phrase. Just like what goes around comes around. It became voguish decades ago. Now, it's complicated. And it's complicated is the perfect rationalization, because it allows for no healing. It allows for no clarity. It allows for no growth. If somebody says it's complicated, well, in a sense, the game's over. So in other words, that I think it's complicated could become sort of one of the ultimate rationalizations. Because by saying that, what can you do? And since our spiritual journeys on earth have literally been made complicated by the uncountable amount of lifetimes that we've led and the choices that we've made, therefore we come into a lifetime with all of this karma and all of these things that we have to learn, that makes sense. But to say a situation is complicated as an excuse and as a rationalization becomes the perfect way of allowing our survival mechanisms to be hijacked by our BS.
And what about the idea about, sometimes we make decisions that when we do things, we, on some level, know we shouldn't have done them.
Right.
Whether it's dating a married man,
lying
to get a job or to get something that we want. And when I think back in my life of times where I, use the excuse that, well, it's complicated about something, I would say that probably 9 times out of 10, it's a situation where I realized that I probably either made a mistake, didn't have enough information, or shouldn't have gotten involved in the first place.
I think that's, in most instances, the case. I hate to make an allness statement 100%, but I think most of the time that's exactly right. We can cloud the issue by letting our survival mechanisms sort of color and wash over our good judgment and sort of obliterate it and all of that stuff. But we know that when we're getting into the relationship with the married man, let's say, we know that it's not a choice that we should be doing. When we're sitting here and lying to get somebody fired at work because we want their promotion, we know that we shouldn't be doing this. When we withhold information from our spouse or from our loved ones or from our friends that they have the right to know. Like, let's say if you're married and you sit there and you spend money that was jointly yours that is supposed to be agreed upon jointly, and you do it anyway. Of course we know in most instances, but we do it anyway because we falsely believe that our survival is tied into making that choice.
It's a scary thing.
Sure it is.
That ability to rationalize it. So at what point do we start to accept responsibility for these choices? How do we stop the rationalization and kind of, in a sense, get off the treadmill here that we're on and start to make a change in that?
Well, I think that there's several things that we can do. First off, instead of rationalizing that it's complicated, what we do is we flip that and start looking at the simple truth. We start looking at the simple solution. In other words, if we're in a destructive relationship, the simple solution is that we have to get out of it, period. Not, it's going to get better, he's lying to me, but he really cares for me, blah, 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 right? So we get to that simple truth, and we do that through stepping back from the intensity of our survival mechanisms and listening. Listening to what friends may have to say to us. Listening to what a good psychic or a good therapist may say to us. Listening to what we may glean from reading a valid self-help book. Listening to what Spirit is saying to us. And that's tricky because when our rationalizations are so engaged, we may not really hear clearly, but we should at least try. And I think the idea of looking at the red flags, they're there. God and the universe are not in the business of fooling us. We fool ourselves. And so in those instances, we have to kick it back to the simplicity of what is the simple solution here and what do I need to do? In other words, if somebody is really dangerously overweight, they need to stop overeating. And I know that sounds overly simplistic when it ties to our emotional defense mechanisms, but it still is the same thing. We need to get past the it's complicated stuff and start looking at the idea of our simple ability to lay a foundation and stay with it, not just be inspired in our aha moment, but taking the aha moment and living out a plan that is simple and makes sense.
Well, if we say it's complicated, we're kind of already acknowledging defeat. It's so complicated, I can't figure this out. And so where's the point, again, then, that we just stop worrying about why we got there, how we got there, whatever, and we just change it. And that's really hard for people to do.
Sure, it's hard because of all the emotional intensity and all of the layers and layers and layers of baggage and BS and rationalizations that have been built on the situation. Let's take, again, the relationship example. If somebody's been in a destructive relationship for 10 years, that's a huge chunk of their life. So to sit there and say, okay, 10 years of this, all of these expectations, I have to just throw it all away, is hard. But I think the important thing is that to never forget that living correctly on earth is not easy. Living correctly spiritually is not easy. It doesn't mean that it has to be backbreaking or metaphorical to working in a coal mine, but it's not easy. And so what we have to do is not lead from it's complicated, our rationalizations, our ego, and our survival mechanisms, but look toward the simple bottom line. In other words, if somebody's a drug addict, I need to stop doing this. If somebody is unwilling to get out and look for a job, they have to do it. At a certain point, one has to do it. And that starts with not colliding with the defense mechanisms, but rising above them by having a very simple plan that gets down to the simple truth. Very simple questions can answer it. Is this situation healthy for me or not? Is my life better because I'm in this situation or worse? What are people saying to me that love me and care for me? The information is there if we're willing to listen to it. And that's where we grow in humility, because we have to be humble to have an open mind. And not saying across the board humble, because that's a process and a long-term process as well. But we have to be able to build from that openness and that humility to be able to receive the guidance and the input that's going to help us to change this. But it's always through stepping out of the nonsense of it's complicated into laying a simple foundation.
And I think that it's important too that one of the things that we remember to do is to honor our feelings in a sense, because all of our feelings need to be acknowledged and validated and nurtured, even if they're not necessarily good for us. That we need to say, okay, I understand how you feel this way, to even to ourselves.
Oh, sure. I think there's a difference between being cynical with ourselves, which is never good.
Right.
Like, in other words, none of us are jerks because of what we're doing or bad people. In other words, we're confused. We haven't learned the lesson yet. We're still in spiritual process. And everybody on earth has both darkness and light. So we're in the process of trying to work through the rationalizations of it's complicated and all of the excuses we make. So of course we have to be compassionate with ourselves and empathetic with ourselves and toward others. But it doesn't mean that we need to coddle and indulge. There's a big difference. Being able to say, look, I'm really sad that I fell in love with this person who didn't love me. I really did care for them, and that meant something to me, versus saying, I'm going to make this work no matter what. I don't care if it's tearing me apart. In the end, it's going to work. There's a difference there between indulging these patterns and these rationalizations versus being compassionate with ourselves. I don't really think that we could really make the healing journey anyway without building it on compassion. We can't just smack ourselves around and expect ourselves to heal. That won't work, because then we'll fight back against being smacked. If somebody's yelling at us, if somebody's attacking us, then additional survival mechanisms are going to get engaged, where we're going to have to protect our honor or protect our freedom of choice or protect who we are. So, of course, attacking ourselves or being attacked by others virtually never helps us in making a healing journey.
Is there a pattern that we go through when we're trying to work with this, whether at the beginning or at the end, where how we view other people and the advice that they're giving us? Or in the beginning, are we looking for someone to validate our defense mechanisms? When we get to the point we're trying to heal it, are we looking for someone to challenge it? How does that work?
Well, I think it's a good point. I think it's really relevant in the psychic field, and I experience it all the time. If we're in denial and we're still wrapped up into it's complicated as a way of having the ultimate excuse, the great excuse. It sounds good even.
Yeah, sure.
It's complicated. You know, life is tough, baby. I mean, you hear people say it all the time. It's great. Okay, if we're in that phase, we're going to look for people to rubber stamp our BS. And there's so many psychics who will do that, who will feed back to us all of the things that we believe that are true, none of which are true, or most of which are not true. Okay, and that's always a dangerous thing. Good friends usually won't do that. Now, say a friend who really doesn't care about our well-being might do it. Like, well, I don't want my friend to get mad at me, so I'm going to tell them what they want to hear. Like, we're going to have a little pity party. Like, yes, honey, I know it's hard when he's having sex with his wife and he's not calling you, but you'll get through it. Okay, it's BS, right? And say, a friend who doesn't really have a person's best intentions at heart might sort of co-opt the delusion as a way of saying, you know, we're buddies, we're friends.
I'll go with you to slit his tires.
Right, right. Well, you know, I'll let you make the harassing phone calls from my cell phone. Right. Of course. That kind of stuff happens. But I think what happens is that it starts with the sincere intention to heal our lives. Until we've reached that point where we are really ready to heal our lives, it doesn't matter what people says. God could drop out of the sky and we'd say, get the hell back to heaven. I don't want to hear this. Okay? So I'm saying that we have to be ready or willing to at least hear it. And then, of course, we will attract the people who are going to be willing to help us. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. So when our intention is to get past this, where we're awash in complicated BS, where we feel like we're underwater in toxic water and we have just had it, believe me, the right information will be there for us. And I think depending on where we're coming from is going to determine what we even attract back to us from a law of attraction point of view. I have this one psychic client that I read for before that actually said to me one time, when I want to hear the truth, I call you. When I want to have my ego stroke and be told fantasy, I call other readers. I was dumbfounded. And I said to this person, you would spend money to be lied to? You know, I mean, this is hard-earned money, right? Very few people have enough money to just say, throw money away indiscriminately. And he said, that's exactly what I do. So I'm saying that even people sometimes become aware that they're doing this, but still do it. Why? Because to comment on your point earlier, they get it mentally, but they don't get it emotionally. And getting it emotionally is so much harder than getting it mentally. Practically every person who's committing crimes knows that they shouldn't be doing it mentally, but getting it emotionally requires open-mindedness, tenacity, the willingness to not fight with our defense mechanisms, but to rise above them.
As we bring this to a close, any red flags that we should think about or be aware of?
I think there are several. I think, again, the emotional red flag of when we feel explosive. Say, for example, when we feel so compelled emotionally that it is literally like an adrenaline rush, that is the most intense adrenaline rush that we have felt. That is a red flag. That is a red flag. Again, there are very few situations in our modern culture, thankfully, where our life is literally threatened, where we're being raped, or somebody has pulled a knife or a gun on us, and God forbid, whenever that happens. But let's say if we're not in that situation and we feel compelled, that's a red flag. We absolutely should not act. In other words, I want to call this person and rip them a new one. Probably the wrong thing to do. Step back. I know he's married, but I don't care. I'm going to go to his house and tell his wife, and I don't care if they call the police. Wrong answer. In other words, I think it's the idea that the emotional red flags are huge. If we feel compelled, step back. Don't act on those emotions. And always look for the circumstantial red flags. I don't believe that God is in the business of fooling us. I never have. And so it's the idea, if the person is married, there's a red flag right there. And don't think of yourself as the exception. And that's another, it's complicated rationalization, like,
Right.
oh, well, so many people date married people, but this is different. There's a special connection between he and I. This is different. This is karmic. This is meant to be. Now, I know it's not usually right, but when you hear that kind of stuff, it's a BS alert in most instances. And again, when we speak of allness statements, there is almost always some exception to every rule. But I'm saying as a really strong guiding light, the red flags will be circumstantially there. But I think foremost, look for the emotional red flags, meaning intensity, volatility. I have to have this no matter what. That's not centered. And in most instances, those emotions are not centered, and they need to be looked at dispassionately, because once we've made the plunge, it is too late to get out easily. And I've seen it so many times as a reader where I'd say to somebody, look, if you walk into the situation, you're not going to be able to get out, but you can get out now. And sometimes people get out now and sometimes they don't. But once they get in, I've seen it take years, even decades, to unweave it.
Then it's really complicated.
Then it is truly complicated, not just a rationalization of it being complicated. I think it's always better to avoid the pain and heartache if we can, because here's a good point, I think, to sort of conclude with this, is the idea that there are certain levels of suffering that none of us can avoid. All of us will die. All of us will experience people dying and suffering. I think it is really terrible when we add on vanity suffering that does not have to be there through our misguided choices that are based on a false sense of survival.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen to that. You want to remind us, the listeners, about your book?
I would love to. For any of you who haven't picked it up yet, get my book, Why the Law of Attraction Isn't Working for You. It's an ebook, and you can get it anywhere ebooks are sold, on Amazon, on iTunes. You can get it on Smashwords, on Barnes & Noble. Feel free to get that, and if you want to have a private reading with me, a private consultation, which would be specifically tailored to your needs, you can reach me at jim1537.com, and I really appreciate you listening to us today. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.